Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the ID Book Club. We are getting toward the end. And so, if you've been with us on this absolute journey through Map It by Cathy Moore, we are taking a look at chapters 11 and 12. And there's still two more chapters. There's one more section we'll spend some time on next week. But as we've gone through this process, and what a process it has been, this action mapping process, as we've been considering Cathy Moore's perspective on if training is a solution, how do we find the correct activities, the correct approach? How do we deal with subject matter experts? How do we convince and persuade those who are asking for such training to be more decision focused, to be more action oriented, because that's what solves performance problems. And last time, after going through the activity design portion where we definitely were spending time determining what type of activities need to be involved in this training event, if that's going to be the case, we crafted a multiple choice question. And as surprising as that was, we can see why. Right, looking through the multiple choice question stems and the options that we discussed, even though we might think of that as being more attuned to the school model, we know that it has a whole lot to do with choice, with decision making. And with choice, that requires judgment. And choice requires, again, decision making. Choice gives us the freedom to draw our own conclusions. And that's where learning happens. And so it's kind of a neat process to see something as simple as a multiple choice question really can make the difference in this learning process. And so it's probably not going to be an easy question if you were following along with us and crafting your own, or if you looked at the examples given in the book. They're not easy questions because learning isn't born out of ease. It's born out of the struggle, right? It's born out of the chaos and the nuance, and those multiple choice questions may help us frame it that way, but it all comes down to choice and decision making. And so we want to continue focusing on that. In fact, Cathy Moore presents to us something that I think is helpful to consider in terms of why we might not want to just elicit learning from the decision point, um, but we also can have learning stem from the feedback. In fact, you can't really have one without the other. Decisions are necessary to really show that performance difference on the job. But more than that, what we need to see is something like she says here. If we are able to give feedback that involves a learner, feedback that, as we're going to see in a second, shows, not tells, we're going to be more likely to remember what we just learned because we had to think about it. And our emotions got involved, right? Showing, not telling, is going to lead us there. And that's when learning happens, not when we're just told, here's the information that you should have known, and here's my feedback for you. Just don't do it again next time. That's not helpful feedback. And we'll talk about that here in just one moment. And so, as she gives us that really simple quote, we have to actually use our brains and try to get the learners to use their brains. I know that seems like a hard task, but I think we can get there, and Cathy is going to lead us through that. In fact, she actually reminds us of this training wheel type of analogy, and it spoke to me fairly well as a parent myself. You got to raise the training wheels up high enough so the kid thinks that they're doing it on their own, but they can have that tilting sensation when they're trying to overcome this struggle, this challenge, this obstacle. But that can get them right back on track too. A little bit of tilt with a little bit of support makes a world of difference. And applying that analogy to our training and the questions that were coming up at the decision points, I think does make a world of difference as well. So we want to focus on feedback that shows, not feedback that tells. And Cathy gives us a couple ways we can do that. One, just going off of that training wheel philosophy, we need to offer suggestions when we're giving feedback. Say they chose the incorrect answer, right? The less than appropriate answer for whatever scenario we've placed the learner in. Well, don't just tell them what to do to fix the problem. Give a suggestion instead. Ask more questions, just like we did in our conversations with the SMEs and with the client. Asking more questions leads to better results. Do the same with the feedback to the learner. She suggests. Don't just get in there and fix their problem for them. We know that's not when learning takes place. If you train someone by doing it for them, well, they won't be able to do that performance changing behavior on the job. Further question, like we just said, and actually like form a discussion with the learner. She gives some really awesome examples here. Again, with our book club, I don't really go through the examples, but I do encourage you to read through them themselves because she does a great job crafting them. And she shows it within these examples that within that feedback, if they choose an incorrect answer, whatever that might be, engage in a dialogue with the learner, just like you would do in live face-to-face training. Make it more of a discussion. Ask a question, let them respond, and then ask another follow-up question to try to guide them to what really is the right answer, all without telling them. Showing, not telling, right? And if we need to, because there could be some pushback from subject matter experts, because that knowledge, that info is so precious to them, if necessary, we can show, then tell. But showing always comes first, right? If that information needs to be revealed and told, here's the solution to that problem, at least give a moment. And Cathy suggests using this phrase, and I thought it was really helpful. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Cause us to pause, use our brains. Don't just tell the learner what to think and do, but let them think through the consequences, think through the reason and rationale why this might have been the incorrect response, and that can make the difference, right? And so, with all that kind of feedback that shows, the one last piece that she suggests to us as well is determine when. Like, should we give that feedback immediately, or should it be a little bit more delayed? And there's benefits to each. In fact, I want to hear from you all. We just jump into our discussion tables where you think that is most appropriate and what the effect of delayed versus immediate feedback might be. But sometimes we want mistakes to happen because that's when learning occurs. And the more mistakes that happen, maybe the more rich that feedback could be, but that feedback has to be delayed to the end. If they're about to make a mistake that on the job could lead to very dire circumstances, she gives examples of like, well, if someone's about to electrocute themselves, then maybe jump in there and give them immediate feedback. But for the most part, maybe that delayed feedback response leads to better, more effective learning. Let that struggle happen. And again, sometimes this depends on the expertise of the individual going through the training. We have to know our audiences. We've said that all along. We have to know the culture. We have to know the audiences. We have to know what they have already gone through in order to have a better, more tailor-made learning experience for them. In fact, talking about giving delayed feedback, you're going to have some pushback possibly because we don't want the learner to struggle. We don't want there to be a challenge. Cathy actually suggests to us this, which I thought was probably fairly true. Most corporate training she's seen underestimates the intelligence of the learner and overestimates the difficulty of the challenge. And so if you think of that, considering how we don't always treat our learners as the adults they are. We need to give them that freedom. We need to give them that space, the freedom to come to their own conclusions. We need to make sure we're not underestimating their ability there. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are assessing what is that task. And so we are trying to fight this. We are trying to design training, if necessary, that shows, not tells, and leads to better results. And let's the learner use their brains, right? Use their brains and make those decisions that they might need to make. But looking at all this, we do know that we have to consider how is that feedback given. And we talked about delayed versus immediate feedback. Again, I want to hear from you on that. But another piece of all this is understanding how structure might affect feedback. And so Cathy spent some time on this as well in chapter 11. And I thought this was an interesting approach because there's maybe two ways that we might go about structuring a e-learning scenario, or if it's live training, the same thing applies. Uh, and we might fall into some traps because really she suggests that most of the time when we say like branching scenario based learning, we often actually end up implementing something like this that she calls the teaching scenario structure. Meaning we're going to give them feedback, but only if they choose correctly could they progress and advance through the story. Now, that requires immediate feedback every single time in order for that story to progress. Now, that might be necessary, and she does not say that we can't use that to still be effective and effective in training for performance changing behaviors. But maybe more so, and this might take more time, time for us to develop, but also more time for the learner to go through. But that's where that struggle is important. The branching scenario structure may allow for more mistakes to be made. Different choices lead down different paths, and some of those paths may not result in success. And that's feedback, and that's delayed feedback, but that's okay. And that actually again may involve more emotions and may cause us to use our brains more. And as you said in the very beginning, we've actually learned something. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. But within these two, whatever one you feel like the training you've built before falls into, you're still giving feedback, but maybe we can make feedback more a part of the story. In fact, she cites Ruth Clark in some of her research and text there, calling this like invisible feedback. Where you don't even realize that you're being given feedback in this process. Maybe that's through, it could be through gauges, it could be through like reading telepathy, reading the person's mind who you're engaging with, like through a thought bubble or something like that. While she might not be a full proponent of those because that's not actually seen in the real world and on the job, you can't read people's minds. I mean, if you could, then I guess might not need all this training. But at the same time, that invisible feedback and integrating it in part of the story makes it more natural and is going to be more effective, whether you use the teaching scenario structure or the branching scenario structure. So using that framework, I thought was pretty helpful in considering where we should go from here, because it's so crucial that feedback is given, because learning is not going to happen without feedback. At the same time, though, we have one last piece of this puzzle that we've been saving for a little bit of time now, and that piece is the info. Why save information for last? We think you already know the answer to that question. If you spent any time reading this text, Cathy starts off at the very beginning, making sure we understand the knowledge transfer, that school model. That's not what we're going for here. But that doesn't mean that information doesn't have its role. But why save it for the very end? Again, I think you might be able to guess pretty well here. It's going to allow us to design activities that support performance, right? That support performance rather than support knowledge transfer. And that's also done because when we're doing that design process, it's going to show us what information is actually needed. That's going to make more clear that information. So we're not doing info dump. We're not giving too much information. It's not just a regurgitation of PowerPoint slides. Looking at performance first, and then coming back to the information that might be needed. But even then, I think there's some kind of neat things we might consider as we're looking at this information part. So we've talked about feedback. Now we're moving on to information. And what does that ultimately look like when we implement that into these training activities, these sequence activities? Well, there's three approaches we might take that Cathy suggests. And so take a look at these three approaches because we might notice that we'll find some things that we may have done in the past that you could connect with, or maybe just maybe if you haven't designed training yet, we can maybe avoid some of those pitfalls. But not to say that they don't have their place, but we can tell and then test, right? And when I say that, she suggests that that's the school model all the way, right? So when you say tell and then test, okay, here's all the information, and I'm going to tell it to you in one form or the other, or you read through this document. Now I'm going to test you on it through maybe some of these like multiple choice questions that we crafted that could be scenario based still. But even still, that format, that process of telling first and then testing second really follows that school model and may not be appropriate. But well, what other options are there? What other approach might there be? Well, we can switch that, right? And we can test and then tell, right? Do an activity and then give the information. And that might be more effective, right? We're looking at active decision making processes throughout this training that change behavior, that change performance on the job. That can help. They're not getting too caught up with the information. Yeah, at the same time, does that information remain with the learner if it's given after the fact? Could. It depends on the scenario and the situation that you find yourself in within your organization. But maybe best of yet, maybe it's not such a logical sequential order like testing first, then information, or information first, then testing. What if we approach it as an integrated approach where we can try a stream of activities? Where it's activity, 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 and information might be linked to each of those activities, this training event with multiple activities involved that might address different aspects of the performance issue that needs to be addressed. Um, but it doesn't mean that information has to come first or second. It's just integrated. So you're thinking, how do you do that? How do we take that third approach for information? Maybe that's through job aids. Maybe that's through letting learners decide when they need the information. And that's the hard thing. We have to stay away from the control aspect and allow them to make decisions. Treat them like adults, right? Because that's really what it is at the end of the day. Let them make decisions. And those might not always be the right decisions, but that doesn't matter because that's where learning takes place. And so, if we are looking at that third approach, a stream of activities, as Cathy suggests, we could use job aids, we could use other forms of information telling, if that makes sense. But you might get some objections because, well, what if we don't tell them the information? They're not going to know what to do. They might, if we start having them go through a scenario and make decisions, but they don't have the information, then they're going to struggle. Yes, that's right. They're going to struggle, but that's where learning happens. And Cathy suggests to us that's exactly what should be going on here. In fact, she suggests that challenge is motivating, and struggle creates deeper learning. Right. That's what we're looking for here. Deeper learning. And you can't have that without the struggle. You can't have that without the challenge. So maybe removing the information, not fully, but not telling the information, letting them engage with it on their own. Yeah, that might present a challenge, but that's going to motivate and cause deeper learning overall. And as we base things off of that quote there that she gave us, really we have to look at all the information we have. So how do we apply this to the action mapping process? We can put it on our action map. We need to put it on our action map, know where it goes, know what activities it corresponds with, as we have our kind of separate rings here, our target in the middle, focus on our business goal. Then we're looking at what actions need to happen and then what activities go along with those actions. But now on the outer ring is that info. But now we need to decide, as we put that on our action map, what does that information look like? And so we might do something like this. So consider, what can they look up versus what must they memorize? And if we can determine that set of information, we're going to have an easier time both on our action map and in our conversations with SMEs or clients, figuring out, can we just put some of that information they can look up in a job aid, in some kind of additional resource they have access to if they need it? But then what else must be memorized? There might be some things that they just need to know in order to do this training, and that's going to all come down to experience. And we have to consider what that might be and what that might look like. And so in order to do that, we're going to focus on encouraging info pulling. And she's referenced this before, we can't push information on to others. They must memorize these things. But if there's information that they can choose to look up, well, they can pull on that information. That's where one less frustration on the learner side is going to happen. I mean, you've been through those kind of trainings where I don't want to sit through all these different slides telling me what to do so I can make the right decisions. I want to practice that, and I might not need it depending on my level of expertise. We're not looking at a one size fits all type of training here. This pulling mechanism on learning is going to allow for more customized and personalized learning for each of these individuals. That's what we're going for. So we can plan our scaffolding, right? And I love that word because if you, as if you used that before, building on each step, it helps with that. Avoiding that one size fits all. We can scaffold by letting them pull the information they need when things get more difficult. If they don't have that knowledge gap filled, well, a job aid or some other kind of resource can fill that gap and help scaffold as we plan out that sequence of events. And we can use models, we can use worked examples, let them see what that looks like first instead of just telling them a bullet pointed list of the info they need. Well, let's show them through a model. Let's show them what the right assembly of this product might be. Let's show them the steps necessary to have a conversation that we're trying to train them in having with those good behaviors. Show them those models and worked examples, and then decide, when is that information provided? Is it at a decision point? They make a decision. Do they need to access information in order to properly make that decision? Okay, it could be immediately given. Is it at a feedback point? Maybe they make the wrong decision and then decide to give them the info that can help them with the decision. Notice how, again, that's letting them pull on the information they need, not forcing them, pushing it on them, and hopefully not turning off the learner from actually engaging in the training itself. And it could be other points as well. Maybe you save it to the very end. Maybe it is that show and then tell later method of what they need to know if they needed it. But the idea is encourage info pulling, not pushing. And as we look at all these pieces together, there's one thing that I think is super helpful too. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. We can focus on something like gradually withdrawing support, gradually pulling back, giving them some supports in the beginning, slowly raising those training wheels higher and higher so that they can, as the scaffolding process goes as well, feel more confident in the learning that they're achieving and going through. And so feedback, information, they are part of this action mapping process. They are crucial to designing these training activities. And I want us to see how that plays out in your experience on the job, in certain perceived scenarios where you can see this applying. And I'm going to turn to you, and I want to hear from what you have to say. So, thought question time. We got 3 of them. We're going to jump into those discussion tables and talk that through for a little bit. Because I've done enough speaking here, I want to hear from you as we work together to hold each other accountable for getting this text read and implemented, hopefully put into practice, right? So, that question number 1 goes back to that feedback point that we are considering. And that is, how does feedback delay affect learning? How does feedback delay affect learning? We said we could immediately give feedback, but have you seen that yourself? Like waiting longer? I don't know what effect that has. It depends on your circumstance and scenario. Can you see where that might be effective? Or does it impact other areas of learning if that feedback is delayed? So we'll focus on that at one table. Another table, though, we'll ask the question, how do we avoid telling feedback within scenarios or scenario-based learning? That might be difficult, and finding that balance is hard. But from your experience, again, can you draw on that and share with us any anecdotes or stories where you've seen this take place, either positive examples of avoiding that telling kind of feedback, or where you feel like the scenario was a good framework, but they still told us the information anyway? How do we avoid that is the question. And then lastly, one more. And that is, how can we better encourage that information pulling, like we talked about? What does that look like in real life? Because we could talk about a list of things we could do, but have you seen that on the job? Too often information is pushed, but where have you seen helpful moments where you can pull on that information when needed. And how did that make you feel? Did it make you feel like you had a choice? Did it make you feel like, an adult, a trusted adult? That can make the difference there, can't it? So 3 questions. We'll jump into those corresponding discussion tables. I want to hear from you. I'll be jumping around to hear some of those responses. And of course, as always, we'll pull some of you up who volunteer onto the stage to share out those suggestions and what you talked about at those tables, so all of us can benefit from those conversations. Thank you so much, and we will see you in just one moment after those discussion tables. Hey, well, welcome back, everyone. Sorry if I had to pause those conversations there. And I just love hearing all the insightful stories and examples that you all bring out. So I do want you to be able to share that with everyone else. We had those straight thought questions, and I saw some activity at certain tables over others. So even if you weren't at the table that for the question that I am posing, feel free to jump on up here and share your experience and thoughts, because I do think a lot of this blends together, right? As we're focusing on feedback, as we're focusing on finally implementing, adding that information, well, it's going to blend together because we're still in that activity design process, and they are all dependent on each other, right? But the first question I posed was related to that feedback delay. Now, I don't think I saw too many people at that table, but if you did talk about that in your groups, about how does feedback delay affect learning? And that's not saying positive or negatively, like it could be a little bit of both, or it just has different results. Where do we see that come into play? I would love to hear from those, even if you weren't in that discussion group, what we came up with there is by raising your hand, using that hand raise button down below. See how that delayed feedback really does affect these next couple of steps too. Again, immediate feedback is fine if that's appropriate, if that's necessary. That's what Cathy suggests. But sometimes it's worth the struggle. And especially if you're doing a branching scenario, I think we talked about that in one of those groups as well. If it's a true branching scenario, you need to wait to the end to really give that feedback. Let them go down that path based on different decisions, and that path itself not leading to success maybe gives them all that feedback they need. But looking further at our other questions there as well, we do want to move on just from feedback alone and consider how we avoid that telling feedback. Now, I know that's a lot of it's related to that delayed aspect, but if we're crafting a scenario, really focusing on the narrative and the story, like how do we avoid telling feedback? Because certainly that's easier to do. It's easier to just state what they need to know rather than go through the longer process of telling them. So how do we avoid that telling and focus on showing instead? Feedback coming up here, Debbie.
Okay, sorry. I
Oh, you're
forgot
fine.
that I had to turn my camera on. So the telling feedback. So I made this mistake in my scenario. I immediately I have the question, and then the answers, and then if you get it wrong, I tell you
Mhm.
this is the harness that you need to use for the dog, not this, because the dog will escape.
Mhm.
So that is telling feedback. Whereas if I allow the learner to continue to make wrong choices, and gently nudge them towards the right direction, it allows the learner to cross different paths and get on a different path,
Mhm.
and see the different, I guess so it allows the learner to make different choices to see, I guess, like what you said, Nathan, the consequences
Yeah.
of their choices,
Yes.
instead of
Yes.
giving them the answer up front. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's exactly right. And we said sometimes consequence is like the best teacher, right? Like, especially if it's like a dire consequence. You want to be able to step in there and give them that feedback, but at the same
Mhm.
time, yeah, like you said, letting them go down those different pathways is going to, again, show them ultimately in a grand scheme of what that one decision point maybe made a difference
Mhm.
in, rather than just telling them, no, stop there and here's why you're wrong. Let's not give them definitions for the incorrect choice that they made, but rather build it into the narrative. And we talked a little bit about this in that group too, right? Like we have to be careful to not, I think Anne mentioned this, like not make it too cutesy and things like not, we don't want to make the story itself detract from the real life experience. But at the same time, we have opportunity, definitely have opportunity to reveal consequences, show them, and give them that space to learn, because that's really what's needed, right? Space to make draw their own conclusions, and not, force the information upon them. No, exactly right.
Yeah, and just as my last thought,
Mm-hmm.
Cathy said something that I hadn't thought about, but it made a lot of sense. She said that when you allow adults to make the mistakes and allow them to get back on the right path, um, it it allows adults to um, so it allows adults to solve similar problems. Um,
Yes.
I know I'm not phrasing it correctly, but
I know
uh,
exactly the quote you're talking about, though. Yes.
so I thought that was really a good selling point as to why we should use showing feedback rather than telling feedback, because it allows people to think differently and solve similar problems,
Yes.
even if it's not the same topic or situation. It makes us more resilient in different
Yes.
situations.
And that's why changing behavior solves
Mhm.
performance, not transferring knowledge. Because knowledge is like specific, moment
Mhm.
specific, area specific,
Right.
situation specific, yet behavior
Mhm.
applies to all sorts of scenarios. Exactly what you're talking about there. Yeah,
Right.
that's why that makes a difference, right?
Mhm.
That's going to bring us to that, solving the business problem, and the
Mhm.
performance problem at hand. Exactly right. Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I really appreciate
You're
that. I
welcome.
appreciate those thoughts. So, as we look at our final question, we got to talk a little bit about that info before we go. So, as we're talking about information, she's alluded to this a few times. We can push out information, or we can allow learners to pull on that. Now, I saw several in this group here, so I'm excited to hear what we had come up with. But I would love to hear all about how can we better encourage information pulling. Did he come up with some strategies, things that Cathy said, maybe real life examples that you found within talking within your groups? How can we encourage that information pulling?
Yep, there we go.
Further.
Hi. So I was in this group when we discussed, I gave an example of how I am currently working on a training for our safety team in my organization. The safety team likes to dump information, and it's like these 10 rules that they're following, and everyone in the
Oh boy.
company now has to follow.
Mm.
But everybody knows these rules. Like you can tell anybody to not, um, something has a frayed wire, don't touch it, or make sure it's locked out, tagged out.
Yes.
So we kind of wanted to go beyond that with the training. And this, again, the example that I gave was, um, they just wanted to push all this information. So how do we pull some of that information out of them? Because they live this day in and day out. So I kind of created a training based on, presenting these 10 rules, but not focusing on the everyone. But I worked in an organization that as we facilitated things, every time we asked 3 questions, it's what, so what, now what? And by asking those questions, you were able to pull information out of the group, not just the basics of don't operate equipment that has, bad wires. Why do we
Yes.
not want to do it? What's the consequences of it? So with this training, I created, every single one, we have that discussion of what, now what, so what, now what? And then in the middle, we put in some scenarios just to practice that. And how you would address it, things like that. But I think it's just asking those questions as you're facilitating
Yes.
or conducting the training to get that information out of your people, and not just, again, the information dump.
Yeah, that is such a cool framework that you came up with there. It sounds like it's successful as well, and Cathy Moore would probably be proud, so that's good. But as you're talking about that, what I'm thinking, like, the asking questions portion, which is what we suggested, that's a good way of letting them think through that process, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Like maybe it is like they do need to pull on some of that information to help them answer that question, but if you never ask the question, that might never cross their mind. And so that's such a cool way of going about doing that. And yeah, I can just imagine, training on 10 rules, and if they know what they are, that there's no engagement there, right? That's unfortunate, but thankfully they have training facilitators and designers like you to help them out there. So that's such a great example. Thanks for sharing that. All right. Yeah. Thanks for coming up and sharing that on the stage with us. And I heard so many other like cool real world examples that, and that's the goal of this too, is like, how can we apply what Cathy's training is here? What we were saying that doesn't work, but also these examples that do work, right? Asking those questions and facilitating learning, not just telling, showing, letting them be involved, letting them make mistakes. That's where true learning happens, with the challenge, with the struggle, but ultimately giving feedback that will hopefully impact and stick with us, because we're involved and we're emotionally engaged in that way. But that's not the final step with action mapping. That's where a lot of us might like to stop, is the design phase. But of course, if you want to jump back and look at a larger scope of like using ADDIE as a framework, we've done the analysis and design. Maybe we've even engaged in a little bit of development, but we do have to focus on a couple other things. And that is, how do we know that this actually worked? How do we prototype this and refine it so we can implement it? But ultimately, how do we evaluate whether not just learning has taken place, but whether there has been some kind of business performance impact to solve bring solutions out for those issues that we've been seeing, that the clients brought up, that target right in the middle of the action map process has been solved and addressed. Well, we do that by continuing to read, because we're moving on next week to chapters 13 and 14. And if you flip to the back of your book and realize chapter 14 is the last one, you were correct. So next week, if you want to join us again, we'd love to have you. Same time, same place. You're reading chapters 13 and 14, or even if you didn't, you can still come here to discuss, because hopefully we'll get something out of it regardless. And then be ready to celebrate having finished the entire book. That has been the goal the whole time, holding each other accountable. And again, even if you haven't been able to follow along, the replays are available on Devlin's YouTube channel. We can continue engaging in the Slack for updates and other further conversation. If you find an example that you'd love to share with everybody else, please go to the ID Book Club channel and share that out with us. Otherwise, I know I've learned so much from not just Cathy's book, but also from you all. So thanks for being engaged and part of the community. I'm excited to see where this takes us as our last final couple of chapters. So we'll read that, we'll discuss, and be ready to talk about it next time. Until then, though, next Friday at 8 a.m. Have a good one, and I'll see you later. Thank you so much.